Good afternoon to those of you on the East Coast. Good morning to those on the West Coast time, Pacific time, and Central time. Those of you following from Europe, from Israel, we want to wish you a good evening. It's been a very significant week, and today we have an incredibly significant group of guests. We want to first and foremost introduce Richard Heidemann. Richard, as well as being the head of a law firm in Washington, over the course of the last number of decades, he has done, from a legal point of view, some incredibly groundbreaking work. We want to hear his story and the role that he's played in terms of Iran, its proxies, and in terms of the legal system for those who've been the victims of terror. Richard, thank you very much for making the time, for joining us, especially, look, your work, not only professionally, but your work as a lay leader. You're an incredibly busy human being, and we're very grateful that you made the time to share with us what has really been an incredible roller coaster ride in your life professionally and what you've done for victims of terror over the last number of decades.
Thank you very much. We're honored to be with you and, of course, appreciative of the great work that Friends of the IDF does. We believe that standing against terror is essential. And it's something that we've been doing for 22 years, since actually the second Intifada. To give you a bit of background, building up to October 7th, let me share with you that Hamas is not the first terror organization to commit the kinds of assaults that we saw on October 7th. And that because we've been seeing these assaults for many, many, many decades. To remind you, there was an organization called the Abu Nidal Organization. And in the 1980s, they hijacked an airplane. There were air marshals on the Egypt Air Flight 648. There was a shootout. The plane went down in Malta, landed. They separated the Israelis and the Americans into first class. They were letting other people off of the airplane, one country at a time, trying to get fuel so they could fly to Tripoli. And as they called forth the first Israeli woman, they put a gun to her head and shot her. And they did the same with the second Israeli woman and the 3 Americans. A number of them survived. For the Americans, we sued Libya, Gaddafi, and Syria. And we actually were able to convince the courts that they should be held accountable. Libya ended up settling, and I'll talk about it briefly in a moment. Syria went to trial. We have a judgment on behalf of those clients, along with other American victims of other Abu Nidal attacks that occurred 1 month later. This is 1985. The Rome and Vienna airport attacks targeted the TWA and LL ticket counters. We learned from the terrorists who I interviewed in prisons in Rome, Vienna, and in Colorado, actually, that they were all trained together in the Bekaa Valley on the border between Lebanon and Syria, under the watchful eye of Syrian military intelligence. And accordingly, we sued Syria also for the Rome and Vienna attacks and received judgments. And then in relation to Gaddafi, in relation to Libya, we also sued for those American victims of the Rome and Vienna airport attacks. And one of the things we learned from the terrorists was that the weapons were provided by Libya. Another thing that we learned is that they were given instructions to attack those airports on the same day at 9 o'clock in the morning in order to send a message to Europe and the world that Abu Nidal, the terror organization, could hit in multiple cities and therefore was to be feared. Fast forward to the first Intifada. Fast forward to the second Intifada. Suicide bombings all over Israel. Buses, Cafe Hillel, Park Hotel, case after case after case, and we represent many, many, many American victims of those attacks. We not only have sued Iran and Syria for sponsoring Hamas, but we also sued the Arab Bank. It's a Jordanian bank. bank with a New York branch. And we sued alleging that they had a client by the name of the Saudi Committee to Support the Intifada, the Second Intifada, and that committee provided money which we allege to be incentives and rewards for murder and the maiming of innocent Israelis, Jews, Americans, and others. And indeed, that case went to trial in federal court in New York. The jury found that Arab Bank was guilty of funding Hamas, providing material support to Hamas. And before the case moved to the jury trial portion on damages, the case was settled. It's a confidential settlement, but the press has reported a lot of information about that settlement. Libya actually wanted to get off the State Department list of state sponsors of terror. And in 2008, Libya paid $1.5 billion to the US government that was distributed $10 million per death and $3 million per injury. Other cases have resulted in recoveries for American victims. I'll mention just one more before I get to October 7th. The Marines who were on a peacekeeping mission in Lebanon in 1983 and were blown up with a Hezbollah truck that came into the compound. The Marines sued Iran for sponsoring Hezbollah. And as a result, massive judgments were entered, and a group of law firms, including ours, was fortunate enough to be able to attach and receive monies that came from the Iranian central bank, came through New York, was attached, and eventually paid out to the Marine barracks families and other victims who participated in that attachment. In the Second Lebanon War, there was an American killed on Kibbutz Sa'ar, a young man by the name of David Lalchuk. We've sued on his behalf, have a judgment against Syria. We also sued a banking entity for providing material support to Hezbollah. In that particular case, the federal judge ruled in our favor that although it was called the Second Lebanon War, Hezbollah was a designated terror organization and therefore should not be entitled to what is generically referred to as the act of war defense. And therefore, we were able to continue that case. It's no longer active. It's confidential. I can't comment. But there are other cases in the last 10 years leading up to before October 7th that are worthwhile mentioning. 3 of them that we have done or have ongoing. I'll take them in reverse order. The most recent one is we represent the family of Ari Fuld, who was killed, stabbed in the Gush. And we sued on behalf of his mother, father, wife, children, his estate, and all of his brothers, except for one that we don't represent. And in that particular case, just a month ago, the federal judge gave us a $191 million judgment, $47 million of which is for compensatory damages, $1 million of which is for the pain and suffering that Ari Fuld endured from the moment he was stabbed until the moment that he ran after the terrorist and actually killed the terrorist before he attacked a shopkeeper. Before that, in reverse chronological order, the Henkin family was driving in a car with their 4 children. The mother and father were killed in front of the children. We represent half the family. It's the husband's side, his mother, his father, his siblings, and a federal judge has entered judgment against Iran and Syria for sponsoring Hamas. And the last pre-October 7th case that I want to brief you on, so you get a picture of these cases and what's possible and what must be done in standing against terror. There was a lone soldier from California. Some of you may know the family, the Max Steinberg family, Oliver Sholem. Max wanted to fight terror. He went to Israel alone. He joined the IDF. He was in uniform during Tzukitan. He was at the mouth, I'll call it, of the tunnels in Gaza, searching for the kidnapped boys. He and his unit were hit with a Hamas rocket. Even though he was in a IDF uniform, we believed that it was an act of terror because Hamas is the designated terror organization. We sued, and the federal judge agreed with us and has entered a judgment against Iran and Syria for funding Hamas. And as a result of that judgment, we've been able to put that family and all of our family clients who hold judgments against state sponsors of terror. Today, there are 4 countries: Iran, Syria, North Korea, and Cuba. So Iran and Syria, clearly in multiple cases, including ours, has been found to be state sponsors of terror, providing material support for Hamas. And as a result, when they get their judgment, they're able to get into the U.S. Victims of State-Sponsored Terror Fund. And some of our clients have received 4 distributions from that fund. And that fund has paid out to some of the clients already 23 to 24% of their compensatory damages judgment. Not talking to you about money. I'm talking to you about justice, holding sponsors of terror legally accountable, and the kind of work that the IDF does on the ground, in the air, on the sea, to provide protection 24/7, not only for in and around Israel, but for the Jewish people around the world. And October 7th, we know, is something all of us are very concerned about that it happened. But as we move now toward October 7th and seeking to sponsor, to hold those sponsors of Hamas and PIJ and others legally accountable, please have in your mind, as you think about this briefing, the fact that there are tools in the American justice system, but those tools have to be carefully managed, carefully approached, strategically and tactically, in order to get us to a result for the families. Not about money, about justice. I hope, Steve, that background is helpful. Joe Tipograph is going to share with us some information about October 7th. Our law firm has already been engaged by a number of families, including some where they lost their loved ones who were in uniform, and will be suing on their behalf the same way we did for the Steinberg family, and also for others who were killed or injured so tragically in and since October 7th. And Joe's going to give you a briefing on a number of cases that already have been filed and are pending in U.S. courts.
Could I ask you 2 questions before Joe starts with October 7th?
Yes.
One is, you mentioned specifically Syria and Iran. My question is, the fact that Qatar, the fact that Turkey are supporters of Hamas, what's the distinction? Why is it that from a legal point of view, no one can go after Turkey or Qatar?
So let me concentrate on Qatar because it's an easier analysis for just a moment. Qatar, Turkey, all the other countries of the world have immunity in the United States, except under certain exceptions. Every country has immunity in the United States under the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, except under exceptions. One exception is the commercial exception. The country enters into a contract, they breach it, there's litigation. Another is the expropriation exception. They take property of an American national that is property in their country, they nationalize it, shall we say. The American victim can sue under that exception. Then there's the terrorism exception. And under the terrorism exception, you can only sue a country that is on the State Department list of state sponsors of terror as it relates to an act of international terrorism committed abroad. Leave 9/11 on the side for just a moment, where the Saudis have been sued, because that's covered by a different statute, because it was an act of terror committed in the United States. But for acts of terror abroad, Qatar, Turkey, every other country except for those four, Iran, Syria, Cuba, and North Korea, all the other countries have immunity, and piercing that immunity is nigh on impossible in U.S. courts. But you can sue non-sovereign entities. So some have sued sovereign wealth funds. Usually those are dismissed because they're covered under the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act. But there's another statute called the Anti-Terrorism Act where you can sue non-state actors. So we have pending, for example, in federal court in New York, an action against a Qatar bank and a Qatar charity, accusing them of having funded Hamas during the past 10 years. And that's the statute of limitations, by the way. You can go back 10 years under the Anti-Terrorism Act and go back 10 years. These are general rules. There are exceptions. You can go back 10 years under the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act. So we already have litigation pending against Qatar, as I said, entities, non-sovereign entities. They then challenge it and they fight the jurisdiction of the courts. They say we're based in whatever city they're based in. We're based in Doha, let's say. You can't sue us in the United States. Then we have to work around the litigation in order to prove that the courts have jurisdiction over them. So that's why, Steve, suing Turkey, suing Qatar as entities, a lot of work. Maybe it's a matter of principle, but there has to be a logical target, and it's very difficult to do. But banks, charities, other funders who knowingly provide money to or support to designated terror organizations are being sued, and they need to be held accountable. The courts have not been friendly on these cases in the last number of years, and there are lobbyists, and we participate in paying the lobbyists to bring to the attention of Congress how the courts have been turning down so many cases, and it's contrary to the original intent of Congress when they enacted legislation called the Anti-Terrorism Act, and then there's another statute called JASTA that designed to bring justice for victims and give them access to the courts. So these are issues we will address again as it relates to victims of October 7th, because there are many who need to be sued, and we all know, going back to your question, Steve, about Qatar and Turkey, we all know they're being provided with housing. They're being treated as if they were wonderful dignitaries. They are not. They are terrorist murderers, and they have to be held accountable in U.S. courts. And the U.S. Department of Justice, we know, is looking very directly at what occurred on October 7th. And they're investigating. They've assigned the FBI to work on it. And I'm personally hopeful that indeed U.S. indictments will be issued. It's happened in previous cases. Some of those, however, you end up with an indictment, but then you have to get extradition. Best example of that is Al-Tamimi, who was the mastermind of the Sbarro pizza bombing from the Second Intifada. We represent the family of Malky Roth, who was tragically killed in that bombing. She was let out of prison in the Gilad Shalit exchange. She went to Jordan. She's treated as a great personality there. She's been indicted by U.S. courts. U.S. has demanded extradition. The Jordanian government hasn't granted extradition, and she is scot-free right now in Jordan. And until such time as Jordan grants that extradition and she's brought to justice in the United States, there won't be real justice for Malky Roth and her family. So these are all battles, legal battles that have to be waged, because we can't let any of them get away with it.
Richard, thank you very much. A member of the firm, Joe Tipograph, who has been working on this as well, really given his life to this cause, is going to share with us information regarding the victims of October 7th.
Thank you, Steve. We To give you a little bit of a lay of the land, we've identified a group of 5 cases that have been brought so far since October 7th regarding sponsors of terror. The first case I want to highlight is Sasi versus Iran. This was brought in January of this year. And, you know, many of you watching this know that Iran has long been a sponsor of Hamas. What you may not know is that on December 27th, Iran's ISNA news agency published a statement by an official spokesperson for the Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, General Sharif, in which Iran took credit for the October 7th attacks as acts of revenge for the assassination of Quds Force commander Qasem Soleimani by the US and the Zionists. In addition to this case against Iran, which is brought under the FSIA exception for terrorism that Richard had mentioned, there have been a number of ATA cases against non-state entities. The first one I want to highlight is the case is called Renan v. Binance. Binance is a cryptocurrency exchange. And what is alleged in that case is that Binance processed numerous transactions associated with Hamas and related Palestinian terrorist groups between 2017 and mid-2023, providing a clandestine financing tool that Binance deliberately hid from US regulators. There are criminal plea agreements and civil settlements that were announced in late 2023, which disclosed that Binance and its former CEO not only knowingly permitted illicit actors, including Hamas and other terror groups, to evade US laws, but it also refused to put into place the legally required infrastructure mandated under US law to stop terror financing. Another case that was brought in Florida is Newman versus the Associated Press. Now, the AP website gave credit to 4 photojournalists for taking photographs of the October 7th massacre inside of the state of Israel. These 4 photojournalists are known Hamas associates who were gleefully embedded with the Hamas terrorists during the October 7th attack. This is what is alleged in the complaint. They sometimes worked for AP, and it alleged it on information and belief that AP paid for the real-time images of Israeli hostages being taken into Gaza, despite having been warned well in advance that at least one of these so-called journalists were in fact Hamas affiliates, and despite the clear indications that they were functioning as full participants of the Hamas terror squad that conducted the October 7th attack, not, as AP chose to pretend, as journalists. The fourth case I want to quickly highlight is Lavi versus UNRWA USA National Committee. UNRWA USA is a US 501c3 that provides support to the as it says on its website, to the humanitarian work of the United Nations Relief Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees in the Near East. That is UNRWA. So it's a nonprofit that funds UNRWA for those U.S. citizens that wish to donate to UNRWA. And as alleged in the complaint, UNRWA USA was fully aware that UNRWA works with Hamas and provided operational financial support for their activities, and that they aided and abetted support for those activities under the guise of humanitarian assistance. The complaint talks about how UNRWA USA collects donations in the US, transfers it to UNRWA, which has the operations in the Gaza Strip. Once the funds reach the Strip, UNRWA redistributes those funds to Hamas members who are on UNRWA's payroll, some of whom directly engaged in acts of terrorism, including but not limited to the October 7th atrocities. The complaint alleges how schools are used to store Hamas's weapons and other equipment. It also discusses the production of educational materials that promote violence against Jews, including the destruction of the state of Israel, and that UNRWA USA raises and transfers these funds knowing that this is how these funds are being used. The last complaint that I want to highlight post October 7th is Pariser versus AJP Educational Foundation, also known as American Muslims for Palestine and National Students for Justice in Palestine. This is brought in the Eastern District of Virginia, and these defendants, as alleged, serve as Hamas's propaganda division in the United States. AMP, the American Muslims for Palestine, was founded from the ashes of a disbanded organization created by senior Hamas officials after those organizations and related individuals were found criminally and civilly liable for providing material support to Hamas and other affiliated terrorist groups. In 2010, AMP expanded its operation to American college campuses, where it founded the defendant National Students for Justice in Palestine to control hundreds of local Students for Justice in Palestine, SJP, chapters across the country. Through SJP, AMP uses propaganda to intimidate, convince, and recruit uninformed, misguided, and impressionable college students to serve as foot soldiers for Hamas on campus and beyond. And so those are just five of the cases that have been brought that we wanted to highlight for you today, because it shows the range of different activities that are being looked at as constituting material support for terrorism in the context of October 7th.
First of all, we want to thank Joe, Richard, for the work that you are doing in ultimately representing victims of terror, representing, justice in this world, and justice as it can be brought about for those, who we can't bring their lives back. We can't bring back the pain that they've suffered, but at least the world could know there are consequences and there's justice. And we can't thank you enough for what you're doing. If I could ask each of you, if you want to share maybe some closing thoughts, share your thoughts, maybe where you see this going looking forward, into the future, where you see this area the next 4 or 5 years, and just some insights that you may want to share. You've given incredible background. You've shared with us specific entities on behalf of specific victims, and you've shared with us an area that really is something we don't read about in the press. It's something that the average person is not exposed to. So we're incredibly grateful to you. Maybe just give us a sense of where this area is going.
Thanks, Joe. Go ahead, and then I'll close up.
Thanks, Steve. That is a great question. So part of my work at Heidemann, Noodleman, and Kalick, part that I really take a lot of pride in working on is I work directly with the clients, the victims. And one thing I want to note is, as I believe Richard mentioned, is under the ATA, it's not just the person who was killed and injured in the terror attack who has standing to bring these claims. It's also their mother, father, sister, brother, husband, wife, son, daughter. And working with these victims and these families, you really understand why, because this isn't just your normal wrongful death case. These acts of terror are heinous. The sudden violent way that people are maimed or murdered rips families apart, and it has a lasting impact on their family members that lasts a lifetime. And it truly is the correct way for justice to be handed out, where it's not just the victim, but all of their family members. And it's for the victims and their family members that we bring these cases, and that we look to hold these sponsors of terror legally accountable.
Joe, I have to ask you a very specific question. It looks like on our screen that you're wearing the Bring Them Home shirt. If you could stand up just a little bit, bring them home now. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you for wearing that on this broadcast. We're very grateful to you for that, and for your prayers and your care. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Richard.
So, Steve, we live in the greatest democracy in the world, and the second greatest democracy in the world, I believe, is Israel, the most vibrant. Here in the United States, it takes many arms and legs and moving trucks just simply to move from one house to another, to represent victims. When we first started this, it was a cause. It's still a cause. we never thought we'd see our expenses back. We never thought we would see fees. It was because we felt it was essential to do what we could in the war on terror to stand against it legally. As we look back over these last 2 decades, if I were to pick one issue that has impressed me, it is the confluence of the efforts of the leaders of our democracy, no matter who was in the White House, to stand on behalf of victims. Some administrations did it in a certain way, others in a different way. But if you look at a total picture of looking back at decades, the confluence of working with both the White House, the State Department, the Department of Justice, the Department of Treasury, the Victims Fund, the Foreign Claims Fund, which I won't comment on more specifically, the other lawyers to work cooperatively with other law firms under the principle that victims will rise and fall, win and lose together, to work with the victims themselves, and then to address members of Congress and involve them, both the House and the Senate, and to go to see those members with our clients who are their constituents and ask them to stand up on behalf of their constituents is very powerful, because they have the ability not just to pass legislation, they have the ability to stop many things if the administration doesn't do something. And the best example I can give you is when a group of us worked on this whole negotiation with Libya, where we had Libya in the courts and we were against Libya's lawyers. We were dealing with Gaddafi's lawyers overseas. We were dealing with the State Department. We were dealing with a federal judge and a federal magistrate. The same time we were dealing with the White House, the administration, and members of Congress, and everybody was weighing in when certain things weren't being done by the administration. There were senators, and I'll give you the example of 2. Senator Norm Coleman put a hold on legislation until certain things happened that assured that the victim of a Minnesota attack, that a Minnesota victim was properly addressed in the legislation. And the other person was then Senator Biden, who represented, of course, came out of Delaware. And one of our clients in the Rome airport attack, that family was a Delaware family. And the senator got very much involved. Every president that we've worked with has taken action regarding victims. They should all now look back to say, we could have done more and we should have done more. And there's a last point that none of us have mentioned. It's the hostages. And I want to put in context not just the hostages that are being held in violation of international law, and all of the heinous acts with regard to the hostages. You know, we've put the burden on the Israeli government to bring those hostages home. But what we have to do is demand of the whole world that Hamas be forced to release the hostages. It's a different approach than bringing them home. They have to release the hostages, and we haven't had a world call that is sufficient. In fact, we have world leaders standing up with Hamas. It's beyond comprehension. And in one particular case that we're actually filing for judgment on today against Iran, it doesn't arise out of a terror attack, but it arises out of the same statutes that we've described today. We represent the Princeton grad student who went to study in Iran for his doctoral dissertation. He was arrested and accused of being an American spy. He was put in the Evin prison and lost almost 4 years of his life, 4 years of his young son's life. And today we're filing for judgment against the Islamic Republic of Iran, for having taken that young man's life and destroyed the family environment of an American who was merely an innocent student, just as the people from Kibbutz Be'eri and everybody else in south of Israel, innocent people, including at the Nova Festival, innocent people. And the world has turned it against Israel. Our world has decided that Israel is not the victim, but Israel is the perpetrator. And it goes back, and I'll close with this, Steve. It goes back to lessons that I learned when we went to the UN Conference on Women in Nairobi in 1985, where my wife was a delegate, and the focus was Zionism, racism, which we were able to defeat out of the document. But in 2001, as you'll recall, was the Durban Conference. At that time, I was the sitting president of B'nai B'rith International and the chair for the Conference of Presidents of their United Nations Committee. So I was the designated head of delegation for the Jewish organizations that went to Durban. A true hate fest. And as we look back on what we are suffering against the demonization of Israel and the Jewish people today, the seeds of those hate were fully planted in Durban under the banner of the United Nations. They didn't care. They supported it. They praised it. They did, after Durban, 10 years later, they did a review conference. 10 years after that, another review conference, I'll call it, giving life to boycotts, giving life to economic and academic boycotts, giving life to hatred against Jews and hatred against other minorities. The Durban Conference was a short name, Durban, in Durban, South Africa. It was really the UN Conference on Racism, and the goal was to defeat racism. And instead, they grew a whole cadre of people who learned how to accuse Israel of being an apartheid, racist, criminal state. And who loves a criminal? Who loves an apartheid lover? Who loves a racist? And who loves a state that embodies all of that? All that hate has been taught on the college campuses. All that hate is embedded in many of these 501c3s that receive literally hundreds of millions and billions of dollars of funding by US and other taxpayers that go to fueling the terror organizations. There is a direct link, in our view, between hate, terror, and anti-Semitism. And until people in our community decide we're going to stand up together, no matter what our political affiliation is, no matter whether we go to shul or we don't, whether we daven or we don't, whether we keep kosher or we don't, no matter what is our heritage, we all have the same ancestral rights. And together, the FIDF, I believe, with your worldwide support, can really make a difference, because the people who support the FIDF believe in the past, the present, and the future of Israel and the Jewish people. And we need each of you as warriors in this battle, because we are indeed not just facing war, not just facing terror, we are facing diplomatic warfare, and warfare in the court of public opinion that is not being fully addressed. And we can't point the finger at a ministry and say they're not doing their job. It's time we stand up and do our job. Thank you to all of the FIDF for what you do.
Richard, and to Joe, to each of you, thank you for what you've dedicated your lives to, and that you've brought. Look, we can't return those who we've lost, but at least there's a certain sense of justice is being fulfilled. At least that there's a just world out there. It's a terrible situation that you have one nation that provides respite to Muslims, the one nation that provides Muslims the opportunity to vote, that provides Muslims the opportunity to go to medical school, to do whatever they want, is being, like you said, by a racist regime in the Palestinian Hamas as members of the Muslim Brotherhood. They've been expelled from Saudi Arabia. They've been expelled from the UAE. They're illegal in Egypt. And that Muslim Brotherhood ideology and theology that can't tolerate a Christian, that cannot tolerate a Jew being on Islamic land, they're being championed. They're being triumphed by Ireland, Sweden, Finland, Norway, by countries across the globe that know better. And it's a sick, cruel world that we live in, that you've got the Muslim Brotherhood being championed by so-called democratic free countries, when the one democratic free country that does more for Muslims than any Muslim country on earth, that looks after Muslim women or Muslim gays more than any other Muslim country on earth, is being called an apartheid nation. It's a sick world we live in. And the fact that you're ultimately bringing justice, and you're taking these atrocities and you're taking these lives and you're exposing them for what they are. We're incredibly grateful to the two of you, to what you've dedicated your lives to. Thank you.